The advance of the Ukrainian armed forces in the Zaporizhia direction, Russian attempts to capture Pokrovsk, and the elimination of an occupier company in the Kharkiv direction. This is War Map on Freedom. I'm Oleg Borisov. Hello. And let's start with information about the advance of the armed forces of Ukraine. We're talking about the Dobropilya and Zaporizhia directions. There, the armed forces of Ukraine have had successes. This was personally reported by the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky. He added that Ukrainian units are currently continuing our counteroffensive actions in the areas of Dobropilya, as well as in other areas, particularly in the Zaporizhia direction near Orikhiv. There, our troops are advancing, and as of today, by more than 3 kilometers. And this is despite the fact that the Russian army is now trying to advance in all directions. In addition to repelling their attacks, in some directions the armed forces of Ukraine are also trying to regain control over Ukrainian territories. Next, let's discuss the situation in the Pokrovsk direction. There, the Russian Federation's army is stuck, as they are being eliminated by the armed forces of Ukraine on the approach to the city. According to the General Staff, over the past day, there were more than 70 attacks by the occupiers there. Moreover, the Russians have resumed attacks using armored vehicles. The occupiers are using tanks and infantry fighting vehicles to transport paratroopers. Staff Sergeant of the 117th Separate Heavy Mechanized Brigade, Alexander Vovk, with the call sign Datzinger, said that this equipment with paratroopers is being destroyed as it approaches Ukrainian positions. The Russian advance is being recorded in the areas of the settlements of Vladimirovka, Zadyshak, Rodinsk, Myrolubivka, and Kotlino. Next, we'll talk in more detail about the Lyman direction. Here, the Russians had launched several offensive actions at once in multiple directions. According to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, the occupiers are trying to expand their control in the area of the settlements of Alhivka, Novyimir, and Mern. In the past day alone, there have been more than 20 attempts by the Russians to break through the Ukrainian defense line here. But all attacks are being repelled. It's worth noting that the Russians are unable to bring up reserves or secure positions for a further assault on Siversk. Ukrainian drone operators are disrupting the invaders' plans. And next, let's talk about the North Sloviansk direction. The State Border Guard Service of Ukraine has shared the results of its work. In the video, drones from the Prime Unit destroyed communication equipment, FPV drone launch positions, vehicles carrying ammunition, hiding spots, and defensive structures belonging to the Russians. As a result, the occupiers suffered losses both in manpower and equipment. And the destruction of antennas deprives the Russian occupiers of communication and connectivity. Now, let's talk in more detail about the work of Ukrainian drones with Dmytro Snihiryev, a military and political analyst. Dmytro, hello. Ukrainian drones have become a nightmare for the Russian occupiers. Which results would you highlight as the most significant? Please, go ahead.
Let's analyze together with you, dear viewers, the latest results of Ukrainian UAV attacks on the territory of temporarily occupied Crimea. The Feodosia Marine Oil Terminal. Special Operations Forces drones hit at least 5 storage tanks. Let me remind you, the oil terminal has repeatedly been the main target of drones from the Special Operations Forces and the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine since 2022. What's notable is that back in 2022, there was information that the occupiers, to protect the Feodosia oil depot and oil terminal, had transferred a Panzer S-1 surface-to-air missile system from the interior regions of the Russian Federation. At the time, the Russians claimed it was unparalleled and had no equals. Moreover, they were practically boasting about a 100% success rate for this air defense system when countering attacks by aeroballistic weapons. As we can see, that didn't happen. It's also worth noting that this is already the second attack on the sea oil terminal and oil depot in Feodosia in the past week. And just a week ago, drones from the Special Operations Forces similarly attacked these legitimate military targets on the territory of temporarily occupied Crimea. And let me point out, dear viewers, that before the recent attacks by Ukrainian UAVs on the oil terminal and oil depot in Feodosia, out of 34 storage tanks for fuel and lubricants, according to various estimates, between 22 and 24 were operational. The last 2 attacks were extremely effective. After the previous attack, The Russian occupation administration couldn't localize the source of the fire for 4 days. It spread to neighboring tanks. And now today, we are seeing yet another series of successful Ukrainian UAV attacks on legitimate targets in occupied Crimea. And I should note, this is happening against the backdrop of a fuel crisis in Crimea. By order of the local occupation administration, no more than 20 liters of gasoline are allowed per person. Moreover, the quality of the gasoline is extremely poor, as even the residents of temporarily occupied Crimea themselves point out. Let's continue our analysis. Strikes were also carried out on the 220 kilovolt Kappa substation. This is, again, Theodosia, which is part of the power bridge connecting temporarily occupied Crimea with the mainland part of the Russian Federation. Let me remind you, even before the large-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russian troops, the Russian Federation announced a so-called federal project for the so-called power bridge, which, according to the central Russian authorities, was supposed to solve the issues of supplying electricity to the occupied Crimea. And, as we can see, once again, it didn't work out. In addition, it should be noted that this so-called federal project turned out to be extremely unprofitable and, as a result, ended up in the spotlight of Russian law enforcement agencies due to the corruption component of the project. It should be noted that as a result of the Ukrainian drone strike, power transformers were damaged, the distribution facility was shut down, as well as the control room and the rooms with protective automation systems. But let's move on. In addition, there was a strike on the Simferopol substation. According to local sources, a series of explosions occurred directly at the substation, which led to the actual paralysis of the facility's operations. In addition, it should be noted that the Ukrainian defense forces are striking legitimate military targets in Crimea. The same drones from the Special Operations Forces destroyed several Russian Aerospace Forces aircraft at the Kacha, Saki, and, accordingly, Zenkoy airfields. In addition, drones from the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine carried out a series of successful attacks, destroying legitimate military targets, primarily enemy air defense and missile defense radars, on the territory of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea. And I want to point out, dear viewers, the strikes are being carried out on the radar systems of S-500 surface-to-air missile complexes, not even the S-400 Triumph, which, again, are touted as having no analogs, but the S-500, which is the latest development of the Russian military-industrial complex. And, as we can see, Ukrainian drones are basically putting a pause on such statements from the Russian side that their air defense systems are capable of actively countering both aeroballistic and aerodynamic threats. So, to sum up, as a result of strikes specifically by Ukrainian UAVs, primarily the Ludiai drone, which has a strike range of up to 2,000 kilometers, 38% of Russian oil refineries, according to Russian sources themselves, have either partially or completely halted their production cycle. This, in turn, has led to a severe fuel crisis across the Russian Federation. According to Russian estimates, the losses to the Russian economy have already reached 100 billion. This is the Russian side's own assessment, dear viewers. These are not figures from Ukrainian or Western media. Moreover, according to Russian estimates, fuel and lubricant shortages are being felt in 50 regions of the Russian Federation.
I understand that. Well, the transfer of Tomahawks will be very useful for the armed forces of Ukraine when it comes to long-range strikes against Russia. But it's also political, because in fact, this is a clear message to Putin, Trump's support for Ukraine.
Yes, first and foremost, it's military political pressure. And notice, the Russian Federation has already effectively lost on the information front. Let's analyze, dear viewers, the previous statements made by the Russian side regarding the possible transfer of American Tomahawks. The response from the Russian Federation will be appropriate. The hint was, accordingly, yet another round of nuclear blackmail from the Russian Federation. So, what actions did the United States take? They redeployed an aircraft carrier directly to Danish territorial waters. This also includes the redeployment of the nuclear arsenal to the territory of the United Kingdom, something that hasn't happened since 2008. And most importantly, it's the redeployment of submarines, nuclear-armed submarines, directly to the shores of the Russian Federation. And notice how the rhetoric of the Russian Federation changed after that. The press secretary of the Russian dictator, Peskov, comes out and says that the Russian Federation treats nuclear rhetoric with great caution. In other words, there's no more talk of nuclear blackmail. Moreover, the Russian dictator makes a statement that, in response to the United States supplying Tomahawks for the needs of the armed forces of Ukraine, the Russian Federation will respond, and here I make a theatrical pause, by strengthening its air defense systems. So, there is no longer any talk of a military response to the United States or NATO blocs. That's what this is about. This is exactly the point I wanted to emphasize. This is, in fact, an admission of both military and informational defeat by the Russian Federation. Notice, the Tomahawks haven't even been delivered yet, but the Russian side's reaction has already changed. In other words, even the very nature of the rhetoric, I want to stress, the rhetoric, not the actual transfer of Tomahawks to the Ukrainian side, but just the rhetoric and statements, has caused real panic in the Kremlin. And accordingly, the Russian Federation fully understands that even just a dozen Tomahawks, which are outside the range of Russian air defenses, would effectively shut down the Russian Federation's oil refining industry. And let me remind you, there are no more than 50 oil refineries on the territory of the Russian Federation. So, 50 Tomahawks could basically put the economic aspect of this war on pause. And that would be a very serious blow to the occupier country's capabilities, both in terms of supplying fuel and lubricants to the global market and, accordingly, its ability to finance active combat operations in Ukraine.
Dmitry, as we wrap up, Politico published a very interesting article where they write that the Russian army is suffering huge losses while making minimal advances on the front. How significant are these losses for Putin? After all, his manpower isn't unlimited either.
With your permission, I'll quote some Russian public channels, so that we aren't once again accused of running a Ukrainian information operation. Severny Kanal, from the rear areas, the battalion commander is forcing the wounded back to the front lines. He's getting the drivers drunk. There are huge problems with supplies. Humanitarian aid is being stolen. Food and water aren't getting through. At best, a couple of cans of porridge, some canned meat, and a liter of water for 2 or 3 people for several days. There's no air support. Supposedly we have artillery, but for some reason it's hitting us instead. People are dying of hunger and thirst. Every other person drank their own urine just to survive. And then it goes on with some unprintable Russians swearing about the situation on the front line. As for the losses, there's a rather telling, controlled leak of information. It's about an intercepted Russian report on the number of casualties. It's around 300,000. Note, that's from January to August. It's also worth noting that the ratio of irrecoverable losses, that is, the killed in action, to sanitary losses, meaning the wounded, is practically 1-to-1. Whereas globally, the usual ratio is 1-to-3. And this is evidence that the Russian Federation and its occupying army are unable to carry out evacuation measures, that is, to retrieve their wounded directly from the front line. Because it was Ukraine that notably introduced the truly innovative and groundbreaking concept of the so-called drone wall, a strategic and formidable defensive barrier creating extensive kill zones within a substantial radius of up to 20 kilometers, where not a single Russian soldier or combatant can effectively approach the critical combat positions, whether they are in heavily armored vehicles or, for that matter, even in traditional cavalry units, attempting to advance across the terrain. That's the key nuance here. Moreover, it should be noted that it was precisely because of this innovative tactic that the Russian army was forced to change the nature and tactics of its combat operations, to completely abandon armored vehicles. That's quite telling. And at this point, according to the Russian side's own data, Russian army losses have already surpassed 1 million. Moreover, the Russians are being forced to increase monetary compensation, trying to lure in new cannon fodder this way. And, as it turns out, There are no longer any willing to sign Russian contracts, even with a one-time, guaranteed payment under the contracts of 6 million rubles, and I should note, they raised it by 2 million. That's quite telling. In other words, the level of losses in the Russian army is catastrophic, even for the Russian Federation.
Dmitry, thank you so much for taking the time to join our broadcast. Dmitry Snegerev was with us, military and political analyst.
Subscribe to UATV English and stay updated on the most important events, top news from Ukraine and all over the world, in-depth analysis, exclusive reports and interviews, all on hand in our channel. Join our community of viewers and stay tuned.